Ezreal. We would be buffing Riven, right? We would buff a bunch of champions that it wouldn't even be a good for the ecosystem if we buff these champions, right? It's like Yasuo players don't want us to buff Yasuo. Their champion would just be banned more, right? Like, their champion would be more contested and no one wants. Yeah, Lee Sin would be buffed, right? It's like we would buff if we buffed exclusively around, like if we were balancing exclusively around the skill curve, essentially, we would be buffing a lot of champions that it would be very bad for the ecosystem to buff, right? So it's like the truth here is that there's some amount of balancing around skill curve, but it needs to be very limited, right? Um, yeah, Ezreal has a pretty substantial difficulty curve, right? And the way we measure difficulty curve, by the way, is what your win rate differential is your first game on average to your 30th game. So yes, it is true that Ezreal actually gains a lot of win rate from his first game to his 30th game. That's just straight up. You might think Ezreal is easy to play, and you can think whatever you want, but like the way that we measure difficulty, which is an objective number that you can't really argue with. You could argue that our description of difficulty isn't good or something like that, but the truth is that Ezreal gains a lot of win rate compared like from his first game comparatively to his 30th game for the same players. So that is how we define difficulty, or at least that's how we define mastery. I guess I should be specific, not necessarily how we define difficulty. Will auto aim system for champions like Ezreal in question ever be nerfed or tuned down? Unlikely, but it is definitely possible. Will you ever release the API for some platforms like PC with UGG or Lolalytics? I don't know. I don't think so. But it's certainly not something we're talking about right now. I see how hard it is to balance between so many different aspects of the game. Higher elo players already think Lee Sin is too strong for his difficulty, but with low elo would seem as bad and hard to play. So I don't even know if the low elo players realize that when they pick Lee Sin, they're trolling, right? It's like, but that's actually true. Is like to go to the thing I was just talking about. Is like currently, if you're a low elo player and you pick Lee Sin, your team is not going to say, "Oh, that guy's trolling. He picked Lee Sin." But actually, you kind of are trolling, right? It's like you actually robbed your team of agency and given it to the enemy team because your champion is quite bad in this MMR, right? Like, and this is true, by the way, even if you put in 50 games of Lee Sin or 100 games of Lee Sin in low MMR, right? It's like until you get to higher MMRs, you actually just shouldn't play Lee Sin, like statistically speaking, right? And there are of course going to be exceptions to the rule, like especially if you're smurfing or whatever. But the reality is that this is one of the things we're trying to avoid is that we want every game to be like as playable as possible, or like we want every player to have agency in every game if we can. Like if like and obviously yes, sometimes stuff is going to happen where you're playing Baron lane and your bot lane just like dies at level 1, comes back to lane, dies at dies level 1 again or something, comes back, dies again. It's like obviously you're not going to have a lot of agency in that game. But we want to try and allow each player to have as much agency as we can reasonably get in each game. And so having champions that are really bad for a lot of players like Lee Sin is kind of contrary to that goal, unfortunately. So that's kind of difficult. This is like a lot of difficulty, right? It's like, I don't know. It's a difficult problem, right? It's like, it's just not necessarily an easily solvable one, which is why we spend a lot of time working on balancing the game. Okay, so let me get back to the doc. I have gotten so far away from answering questions in the doc recently. So let me try and at least get through this page for now. So I'm gonna slow down on looking at the chat here for at least a little bit. So let me get there. Okay, so if 3.0 is a slow patch due to holidays / other reasons, how much balance / new content should be expected in a normal 3.x patch? This is something that some of the podcasts were talking about of like some people recognize, like I was talking about 3.0 being on the slower side of things. It's hard for me to say exactly how much because I'm not entirely sure. A lot of this depends on a bunch of variable factors, and like I've said more than once during this podcast, but during this stream, um, stuff gets moved into and out of patches at the last minute, probably more than it should, and so it's hard for me to say. Right? It's like I can tell you our like ideal plan here is that we would probably have at least something in terms of a new systems content, whether that's a new item or a couple new items or a new rune or significant item reworks or a small champion rework or something significant in terms of systems in every patch. Um, but I can't guarantee that we won't have another patch like 3.0 where we don't have any of those things, right? It's like I can't guarantee that because sometimes stuff happens. Uh, so that's sort of how I would frame it is like I can't really answer this question honestly. Um, but the truth is that hopefully the average patch is a fair bit bigger than 3.0, but I can't promise it because stuff happens. Where the doc questions came from, they're terrible. I asked people on my on Twitter to DM me. I took some questions off Reddit. I took some questions from podcasts. I basically took every possible place I could think of at the time to get reasonable questions. So if you think they're terrible, then sorry, but I got the questions from every place I could get at the time. Can you say when next patch will come? No, I cannot. Their game is good, but there should be 2 champions a month. It gets boring after a while playing the same heroes. Thank you. From a personal perspective, I kind of understand like the player like frustration of like, hey, please, can we have more champions? It's like, yeah, new champions are cool, but like new champions also come at a cost, and uh, something you don't necessarily understand is like where we can put those other resources. And to be clear, I don't necessarily know where we're putting the other resource, like we're putting the resources that would go on other champions. Like I am not 100% sure where those resources are going, but just because you're not getting champions, don't think of it as like you lost this thing that you were getting and you're not getting anything in return. It's like you have to keep in mind those resources will be repurposed and used for other stuff, and so you will get other stuff instead, right? Like, it's not like we are just like it's not like we're like, oh, we're only doing 2 champions a month. Let's just fire half the people on the champs team, right? It's like that's not what we did, right? It's like so those resources are going somewhere else. I don't know where, but uh, resources are like zero sum here, right? So if you're not getting something, you're getting something else instead. So that's how I would kind of try and frame it here in terms of uh, this could mean that the champion releases you get will be will be higher quality, right? It could mean that. It could also mean that you get something else entirely. But um, yeah, that's basically how I would put it. Um, you're not necessarily losing it. You're just losing something. If that hopefully helps people frame it a little better. Okay. Um, are you planning to add more AP junglers? I would like to do a more AP junglers, but I'm not on the champs team, so I don't really have any control over that. Uh, I do have some small amount of control over whether we can buff AP junglers that exist, which is why we buffed Morgana. I was not the one who pitched it, but I did argue very strongly that we should buff Jungle Morgana because people want AP junglers, and she is a champion that we can put in the jungle that does magic damage. So also, for anyone who's new, I have said this multiple times, but anything having to do with matchmaking, report system, et cetera, all the stuff that's outside the game, I cannot answer those questions because I am an in-game designer only. I only work on in-game content, like stuff that's literally in the game, balance and systems. Jungle Morg is the thing. Yeah, we buffed it. Uh, up to people to figure out how good it is. My understanding is that like I've played it a couple times and I thought it was like decent but not crazy, but some people seem to think that it's like very OP. We'll see how that pans out long term. We'll see. But I played it a few times. Even doing the crazy like double camp clear, which is I found to be quite difficult. I had to practice it in practice tool a bunch. So okay, so let me get back to the sheet here. In the future, is it possible for the Wild Rift map to be bigger like PC, with alcoves and the turrets inside the base? I think Wild Rift is still fast-paced even with this map bigger, since the objectives will spawn sooner, gold and XP easier to gain stuff. I think it is unlikely that we significantly rework the map anytime soon. I think we're pretty happy with the state of the map currently. I think alcoves would be cool if we could figure out how to do those at some point. I don't know necessarily, but I think alcoves would be cool. I think the thing with them on PC, because I was actually on PC as a game analyst when alcoves were being added, and I was pretty negative on alcoves originally, and I was like, I feel like these just don't do anything. And basically, what I found was like most of the time that's true, right? The alcoves don't do anything in most games, right? But it's like I think it's pretty cool when they do something, and so it's kind of like a system. It's like it has a relatively high cost to add, but it does feel like it's just positive for the game. It's like, oh, it's cool when the alcoves get used, and if they don't get used in a game, then that's whatever, right? It's like it just doesn't really matter. So yeah. Anyway, let's see. So, hopefully, basically, the short answer to this question of like, do I think the map will be bigger, or like, is it possible? It is possible, yes. Do I think it's likely that we're going to expand the map anytime soon? No, I don't think that that's very likely. Um, so, that's sort of how it is. I think Garen really needs the rework he received on low PC. His build varieties are null, and for a moment, more top laners are introduced to week. I think the PC rework has some very strong, like has some really good points, and it has some really strong negative points. I think that would be a conversation we probably should have internally. We haven't really spent much time talking about Garen, honestly, internally in the recent times. So we should probably spend some time talking about like, hey, should we do the PC Garen version, right? Because it's like there are some very clear advantages, right? It's like attack speed scaling on spin I think that's like really positive. But we'd probably have to take away the tip crit spin instead, the version that Wild Rift has. So there's some like very significant trade-offs we would do for Garen. Uh, I don't have any like super strong feelings about that. But let me get back to the sheet here real quick. Okay, so getting through these in order. Shyvana AP ratio coming for Q and W. Unlikely. Uh, Generally speaking, we most of the people on my team don't think AP Shyvana's gameplay is very good. I personally like AP Shyvana, but I understand why they don't think that why like so the AP ratio on Shyvana's Fireball is intentionally cut in Wild Rift, right? The champ designer who made it originally made an intentional decision that we were not going to do AP Shyvana in Wild Rift. Doesn't mean that I couldn't change that now as a balance designer because as the, like my team now owns all champions on uh, the live environment. And the truth here is that if we decided as a team we want to do AP Shyvana, we could just do it, right? We own it, so we could. But I think it is unlikely my team will align on doing that. And I think there's good reason that like AP Shyvana's gameplay is not spectacular. That being said, also if you look at PC, even though for the past like since AP Shyvana was created, which was about 4 years ago, right? Those AP ratios were added in PC or increased in PC. Shyvana has been significantly more popular. Even though the AP build has basically never in PC been better than the Bruiser build, it has always been more popular, right? So it's like I think that's a good argument of like, hey, people are willing to play AP Shyvana even if it's not as good as AD Shyvana. I think there's a good argument that that's like good value for the character that people can play her in this alternative way, but also the gameplay is not particularly good. So there's an argument that it's like, hey, maybe we should just rework Shyvana in some meaningful way because she needs a bigger rework. For Zed Jungle, I talked about this before, but short of it is like it's not our priority right now, but I would like to do stuff like Zed Jungle. And shield breaking items I talked about a lot before. I think eventually we'll get something like Serpent's Fang. Probably not like Shadow Flame. I don't think we're very likely to do anything like Shadow Flame, honestly. Will we get cookies and pots in Wild Rift? Very unlikely. I think we're unlikely to do any form of consumable. Um, Consumables are just not really something that we're interested in Wild Rift. So that's kind of it. Yeah, another fair point in favor of AP Shyvana is that like, yeah, there is a lack of AP junglers currently. There are a couple, but they're not like spectacular. And it's like, yeah, that's fair that we could do, Shyvana as an AP scaling jungler. That's a good argument for her for sure. Okay, let me. Uh, I'm not actually out of water, but I do need to get up real quick and go grab something. So I will be right back. Give me like 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, I'm back, but you can't see me yet. All right. Sorry about that. Had to go grab a package real quick. Probably should have refilled my water while I was at it, but I did not. Anyway, okay. So, is there anything that seems like an immediate thing to answer? Blah 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 blah. Doesn't seem like anything that I should immediately get. Yeah, I'm just gonna go back to the sheet. I do want to make sure I get through the entire sheet, and I'll stick around and answer some questions afterward. Any pink ward talk about that? We've been talking about pink wards recently. We've been talking just in general about like camo counterplay recently. So that's something we've been discussing. Again, it's not something that we're like definitely going to do or that we're definitely shipping anytime soon, but that that is not something that we have any interest in. So anyway, yeah, and by the way, I am gonna start timing people out for being like really disrespectful to my colleagues. So if you do that, I'll time you out. If you do it again, I'll ban you. Sorry, but I'm not gonna sit around and like just sit here and watch people flame people that I work with. That's just not happening. Um, player vote matters at all. You're on the side of no pink words ever. Well, as I've learned over the course of this stream, I hear you're a big Eve player. Um, anyway, so let me get back to the sheet real quick here. Hello, is there any chance that the champion portrait bar can be positioned to the right and give it a lateral/horizontal option? And since the enemy and that the enemies are also by default optioned to quickly indicate if they have an ultimate or not. Because if puncturing it while moving makes it too difficult. Oh, this is translated, by the way. This is like the reason this sounds so weird is this is Google translated, I believe, or maybe DeepL, I don't recall. So you can also drag an alert to an ally so that the alert appears in their position. Also for the utility of some ability like Shen, lol PC style, that if you have a mouse over the portrait and press R. So I think a lot of this stuff is interesting. At the very least, I think the last point, like the being able to hover an ally portrait to be able to select someone, I think is actually pretty cool. And I'm assuming that this is probably something that's been considered, but I can't tell you like where exactly these like all these things sit in terms of like priorities for UI. I don't know what they're working on because I don't work on that team, but I will tell you I will have a conversation with people about this type of stuff. I think especially this last one, like I think this is something the like being able to select your allies specifically like via their portrait, I think is actually kind of an interesting thought. And I don't I assume they've probably considered it, but I'll at least have a conversation. I can't really tell you like hey, this is why or why not we will do this or will not do this or something like that. Because again, I don't work on this team and I don't know all the context behind the UI and stuff like that. Um, so I can't really say like to give like too much of an important answer, but I will tell you that I will bring this up to the UI people and ask them if any of this stuff is like easy to do or like stuff they've already considered. But again, I just wanted to address this because I thought this was like an interesting, like this is like kind of an interesting set of requests because it's like, yeah, all this stuff seems like it would be pretty interesting options at least. Um, so, uh, so let's see. Okay, so is it possible to add vibration/sounds for the joystick movements? Sometimes because of sweat, my touch input won't get recognized and I'm dead because I stopped moving thinking that I got rooted. This is something that I think would be really cool. Kind of similar to the above one. I think this would be actually quite cool. Like this seems like it would be a really good optional thing, like haptic feedback. But I don't know the complexities of this. I assume this is probably different per phone, which is probably the difficulty with this type of thing. Since not all phones have the same, internal systems and so on. So I'm honestly not entirely sure how difficult this would be, but again, this is something I can at least bring up to them and ask them like, "Hey, is this something you've considered or something that you've tried, etc." Again, I probably don't have a super satisfying answer here, but I can tell you this is something that seems cool. I personally would be interested in it, so I'll at least bring it up. Um, for the Jana main question, the Jana rework thing, what I said previously, I'll give you the short answer, and you can look back in the VOD if you want. The short answer here is we are not immediately going to do it. If long term or sort of medium term, the Jana rework is successful in PC and people like playing Jana more, we will probably do it at some point. Something to note is that we are more likely to do something for Jana eventually anyway, even if we don't do something what PC did, because Jana is, I believe, the lowest depth champion in Wild Rift currently, in the sense that if you play her, you are least likely to play another game, meaning that players probably don't like her gameplay very much. So we are probably going to do something for Jana eventually because very clearly her gameplay is not hitting the bar. Like she could just be better. So we'll see. Can we get question mark this ping from League PC, please? It will solve all communication gap. So let me tell you a secret. The UI designer who made the UI stuff who made the pings and stuff really does not like the question mark. I really like the question mark. However, the current UI designer doesn't, who still has ownership of it. So I don't think it's very likely to get added. Don't worry, Stuart. I don't think it's happening. But uh, it's not up to me. I can tell you this is a conversation that I hear internally probably at least once a week in our playtests. Uh, I'll tell you. So this is a secret inside playtest. I'll give you a secret viewship. There's a producer on in game who really, some people would call him toxic. He really likes to perhaps do some BM. Um, and probably on average about once a week in playtests, he'll talk about how he wishes he could question mark ping. And then usually the UI designer who has ownership over this stuff tells him no. And then they have an argument about it for probably 30 seconds, and then it stops. This probably happens about once a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. So I think it's pretty unlikely to happen. Basically, the current owner does not like it, does not think it's worth adding to the game, thinks it's probably value negative, and so it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But anyway, that's sort of a inside view of our playtests. Sometimes is some complaints about the missing ping, and then some berating over you're not getting a missing ping. Or sorry, the question mark specifically. Why do we have the question mark emote? That's a different team, different system, and I think the designer that owns that is actually totally okay with that one. Okay, so not a question, but what I want to be implemented in Wild Rift is to make Fog of War darker, just like on PC, even though the fog visibility has the lowest, it's still not dark enough. Actually, this is interesting because we had a bug in our playtests a couple weeks ago where the fog was darker. So I actually only included this question because this is like not a question, right? It's like a statement. Um, I only included this because, interestingly enough, we actually tested with this, not intentionally, it was a bug. We had a test like this where everything was the mini map and the fog was actually really dark. Um, I suspect there's probably a middle point, but I can tell you if the fog is really dark, the game is actually just feels really bad. Like it feels really weird. I can tell you is like getting used to that was a really bizarre experience. So uh, the fog of war. I think there's a good argument it should be a little darker, but there's probably a fine line of like how much darker it can be before it starts to feel really bizarre. Um, so that's something that's just sort of interesting to note. Okay, so let's go through some other questions. Um, Going back to the Jaina depth thing, which champion is the highest depth one in Wild Rift? It changes based on the patch. That the top 5 slots are like pretty close together. I think top 5 champions, some of which you may not expect. There's champions like Yasuo, I believe Riven, Lux is up there. The one that I've talked about, I actually spent a lot of time doing research on this because I think a lot of people may not expect it. One of the champions that's usually in the top 5 depth that people won't expect, Tristana. Tristana is actually a super high depth average champion. Um, so for whatever reason in Wild Rift, the people that play Tristana play a lot of Tristana. Don't know why. I did a lot of data research and I can't really figure out why. But that's something that is surprising to people or like it's at least it's surprising to me. I think it'll probably be surprising to most people. It's like she's actually often up there, and there have been patches where she's actually the highest depth champion in the game, which is like kind of shocking to me. Like Tristana, right? More than Yasuo or someone else. It's like really surprising. I'm not sure why. So, um, that's kind of an interesting one. Um, Any thoughts about including the mythic items like League PC or at least the control words? I spent a lot of time talking about this. I'm going to try and make this the last time. But mythic items themselves, there is a possibility for many of them to be added as legendary items. We are very unlikely to do the actual mythic item system. Control wards are a possibility. We have discussed it. It is not something we are definitely going to do, but it is something that we might do at some point. Can I hire you for balance Eve specifically? Probably not. I don't think we have the budget to hire someone with 3K games on every champion. That sounds a bit tough on our budget, you know? Um, okay. So all right, I'm gonna drop the chat for a little bit here and try and get through some of the questions here on the um, try and get some of the questions on the sheet. That's the word I'm looking for. Sorry, I forgot the word for some reason. Okay, so please make if Riot launch new champ, someone need to play ranked. This champ need at least some mastery level or tutorial like something. So this is a debate that I've seen a lot, right? It's like, and I've seen this in many different games, right? Like for example, HOTS had a system like this where you need to have a certain minimum level of mastery in order to play to play the champion in their ranked system, right? Um, there are upsides and downsides to these systems, right? Like, some games have them, some games don't, right? And I think there's some very clear advantages, right? It's like one is it's harder for people to just like grief by picking a champion they've never played before, right? It's like it does cut off some forms of intentional and also some forms of unintentional griefing, right? It's like someone thinks like, hey, this champion is a good pick here, but they've never played, like, oh, you want to play Ari, but you've never played her before, and you think it's like a really good matchup or whatever, but it's like, maybe you're just not actually very good at Ari, and you don't play her correctly, and you kind of unintentionally grief your team, even though you're trying to win, right? It's like, so I think the fact that it cuts off some unintentional and intentional griefing is good, right? It's like there's some positives to that for sure. Um, there are also some negatives. One of the huge negatives is that it makes it significantly more difficult for us to get meaningful, like good, meaningful data on new champion releases, because then we've not only split our user pool between the like PvP non-ranked setup where we were like forcing them to play in PvP, it makes it way more difficult for us to balance new champions as one example of a downside, right? Um, so the truth here is that like we can run into difficulties with this where we're going like it will make our ability to balance these champions when they come out much worse, right? It's like we will just not have good information on them, and there's a cost to this, right? Um, there's other costs, like this actually also makes it so that people are much less likely to play new champions, right? Um, and it's not just from the like, and you might think like very cynically, you might think like, oh, you're just talking about not making as much money off champions. I'm actually just talking about people enjoying the game. Like we know from data that people who play a lot more champions are more likely to enjoy the game, right? And we're here to like try and let players enjoy the game. We want people to like the game, right? We're not just here to like make a bunch of money, right? It's like if I were just trying to make money, I would go work on some other mobile game that makes, like that's a gotcha game or something, right? That's just like, milking its users for as much money as possible. Anyway, so from the perspective of like enjoyment, we know people enjoy the game more if they play a lot of champions or they at least try different champions at different times. And if we put a significant barrier to players playing new champions, we expect this would actually make the game less fun, right? Like there are some parts of it that like yes, there are positives, but you have to keep in mind there's also some pretty big negatives. And so overall, it's just not something we've decided to do. Um, I don't know. I don't have like a great answer for this I mean it's not even a question, it's just a statement, right? It's like I don't have a great answer for this other than to say that like yes, I think there are some very clear advantages. There are some clear disadvantages, and we haven't really come up with a system where we're like super happy with a restriction for playing new champions, right? So I don't know. It's a tough one. Um, so I just wanted to address this because I thought this would be like relevant to talk about, but not something that I have like an instant great solution for. Because I agree, I recognize the problem space of like, yeah, it feels really bad when someone first times a champion in your ranked game, and they're whether intentionally or not, they're basically griefing you, right? It's like that sucks. So uh, wouldn't it be more convenient to do it in text dev format? People who don't speak English might want to know about your thoughts. Yes, it would be for many people way better to do this in text. However, text has a cost, right? It's not like the people on the loc team are going to go localize 3 hours of me talking to people or 3 hours of me writing on a page, right? It's like that's not free. And also keep in mind, I'm just doing this on my own time, right? I'm not spending my work time doing this stuff. So basically, it's a question of like, yes, I agree. It would be great if I could talk to players in every language and I could send a message to them and I could hear their thoughts and all that stuff. But it's just, look, I only speak English. I am American. I can only speak English. Sorry. It's just how it is. Uh, and the truth is just that I can't necessarily like account for the fact that um, there's a lot of languages to localize into. There's a lot of work to be done. And also, if I were spending actual work time on this would be less time me actually working on the game, right? It's like I love talking to players. I want to talk to players, and I want to spend time like hearing players, talking to players to let them know our thoughts. Here, this is a mutually beneficial thing, right? It's like you get to hear our thoughts, we get to hear your thoughts. Everybody wins. Um, but I do this on my free time, right? I'm not, I'm not getting paid for this. Um, so it's difficult because yes, text format is something that I would have to do on my work time. And I think, and to be clear, I think we will do something like something. I don't know what the most valuable topic to talk about is, but it's not like I'm just going to write like a 20-page treatise or something like that on, you know, I don't know, the state of Wild Rift or something like that. It's like it's got to be